Why good men don't feel safe loving modern women. Good men can't tell the difference between women who are promiscuous and women who are wives because of modern society and a lot of toxic feminist agenda and movement. I know women hate the idea that men feel like their body count matters, but here's what I want you to think about and consider, right? From a male's perspective, right? From a man looking at it, it sounds like you have number one, low self-esteem. Any woman who allows so many men to engage with them physically, intimately, is the number one marker of a low self-esteem. That's number one. Number two is poor decision making. So what do we say now? Low self-esteem. I have to write this down. Poor decision making.
There is a quiet shift happening right now that most people do not want to talk about. It is not loud protests or dramatic headlines. It is something far more dangerous because it is invisible. Men are changing their behavior, withdrawing their energy, and stepping away from systems they no longer believe in. If you stay until the end of this video, you will understand why this shift did not come out of nowhere, why it is accelerating, and why it may already be irreversible. Before we get into it, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, and select all if you want more angry guy content and want to get every single video the moment we release it. That support matters more than you realize. Also, make sure you check out Angry's Crypto Academy if you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth. The Academy teaches you how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly. And it is linked in the description of this video. So go check it out now while it is available. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support directly, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It helps keep the lights on and the content coming. Now let us talk about what is really happening. And there is a growing feeling among men that does not get discussed honestly in public spaces. It is the feeling that they are no longer safe, not physically in the obvious sense, but socially, emotionally, and legally. Many men have reached a point where they believe that any interaction can be misinterpreted, reframed, or weaponized after the fact. This is not paranoia pulled out of thin air. It is the result of years of messaging, policies, cultural narratives, and public examples that taught men a simple lesson. The risk is no longer worth the reward. For decades, men were told to change. They were told to soften, to step back, to listen more, to speak less, to apologize more, and to accept blame for broad historical forces they had no personal role in creating. Many men did exactly that. They adapted, they complied, and they tried to meet expectations that were constantly shifting. What they discovered was that the goalposts never stopped moving. No matter how much they adjusted, it was never enough, and the tone never softened. At the same time, men watch public narratives evolve in a very specific direction. Men as a group were increasingly described as defective, dangerous, or unnecessary. Masculinity was framed as something that needed correction rather than understanding. Traditional male roles were criticized, while no equally respected alternative roles were offered. Men were told they needed to do better, but no one could clearly explain what better actually meant in practical, consistent terms. Trust is the foundation of any functioning relationship, whether personal or societal. Once trust erodes, people do not usually announce their departure. They disengage quietly. That is what we are seeing now. Men are not marching in the streets or demanding attention. They are simply opting out. They are avoiding dating, avoiding long-term commitments, avoiding institutions that they believe no longer operate in good faith toward them. One of the most important things to understand is that this did not happen overnight. This was not triggered by a single movement, a single trend, or a single generation. It was cumulative. Each year added another layer of caution. Each public example added another reminder to be careful. Each viral story reinforced the idea that intentions do not matter if perceptions can be reshaped later. Many men learn that silence is safer than explanation, distance is safer than engagement, solitude is safer than vulnerability. Over time, these choices stopped feeling temporary and started feeling permanent. What began as self protection turned into a lifestyle. There's a common response to this conversation that immediately frames men's withdrawal as bitterness or entitlement. That response misses the point entirely. This is not about anger, it is about calculation. Men are weighing risks and rewards and making rational decisions based on their lived experiences. When the cost of participation feels unpredictable and the penalties feel asymmetrical, withdrawal becomes the logical option. Another part of this conversation that is often ignored is how men process change. Men tend to internalize lessons through outcomes rather than slogans. When they see repeated examples where good intentions lead to negative consequences, they adjust behavior. They do not argue endlessly, they adapt quietly. This is why so many people are surprised by how widespread this withdrawal has become. Men did not announce it, they just stopped showing up. There is also a major disconnect in how trust is understood. Trust is not demanded into existence, it is built slowly and destroyed quickly. Once broken, it is incredibly difficult to restore. Many men feel that trust was not only broken but dismissed as unimportant. When men tried to express discomfort or concern, they were often told their feelings were invalid, exaggerated, or part of the problem. That response did not rebuild trust, it accelerated its collapse. What makes this moment particularly significant is that men are not experiencing this as a loss. Many are experiencing it as relief. Stepping away from constant scrutiny, unclear expectations, and social tension has brought a sense of calm they did not realize they were missing. Peace has become more valuable than approval. Stability has become more attractive than validation. This is why attempts to shame men back into participation are failing. Shame only works on people who still care deeply about the approval of those doing the shaming. Once that emotional leverage disappears, the tactic loses its power. Men who have found contentment in solitude are not easily persuaded to re enter environments they associate with stress and uncertainty. Another overlooked factor is economic reality. Relationships and family formation have always been closely tied to financial stability. Rising costs of living, housing, and basic necessities have made traditional paths more difficult. When you combine financial pressure with social risk, the equation becomes even less appealing. Men are asking themselves what they are being asked to sacrifice and what they are realistically gaining in return. This leads to a broader societal question that few want to confront. What happens when a large percentage of men disengage at the same time? Societies are built on participation. They rely on people choosing to invest their time, labor, creativity, and responsibility into shared structures. When a significant portion of the population decides that the system is not worth engaging with, the effects ripple outward in ways that are not immediately visible. Historically, men have shouldered a disproportionate share of high risk, high stress roles. They did so in exchange for purpose, respect, and a sense of belonging. When those rewards are removed or replaced with suspicion, the incentive disappears. You cannot run a system indefinitely on obligation alone. Eventually, people stop volunteering. There's also a psychological component that deserves attention. Men tend to bond through shared effort and mutual respect. When they feel consistently portrayed as problems rather than contributors, that bond weakens. Without a sense of being valued, motivation declines. This is not a moral failing, it is human nature. One of the more ironic aspects of this situation is how often the withdrawal of men is interpreted as proof of their supposed flaws. Instead of asking why men are leaving, the assumption is that their departure confirms negative stereotypes. This creates a feedback loop where misunderstanding fuels further disengagement. Each side talks past the other, and trust continues to erode. It is also important to address the idea that men owe participation regardless of how they are treated. No group operates that way indefinitely. Participation is always conditional, even if the conditions are unspoken. When those conditions are violated repeatedly, people reassess their involvement. And men who have walked away often describe a moment of clarity rather than anger. It might be a conversation, an experience, or a realization that they are constantly on guard. Once that realization sets in, returning to the previous state becomes difficult. You cannot unsee patterns once they are clear. This does not mean men hate women or society. That assumption oversimplifies a complex reality. Many men simply no longer trust the framework they are being asked to operate within. Trust is not the same as affection. You can care about people while still choosing distance for your own well being. What we are witnessing is not a temporary trend. It is a structural shift in how men relate to the world around them. Technology has made withdrawal easier. Work can be remote. Entertainment is abundant. Communities can be formed online without physical proximity. The barriers that once forced participation no longer exist in the same way. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. When men find fulfillment outside traditional structures, the pressure to conform diminishes. This is why calls to return to old norms ring hollow. Those norms existed in a very different context. You cannot recreate them without addressing the conditions that made them viable in the first place. There is also a generational aspect to this shift. Younger men grew up watching older men struggle through systems that offered diminishing returns. They learned from observation. Many decided early on that they would choose a different path. This is not rebellion, it is adaptation. Some people believe that men will eventually return once conditions become difficult enough. That assumption underestimates how deeply many men value peace once they experience it. Hardship does not automatically push people back into systems they distrust. Sometimes it pushes them further away. The phrase walking away captures this moment accurately. It is not running, it is not collapsing, it is a deliberate step back. Men are choosing to focus on self development, financial independence, personal interest, and mental stability. They are redefining success on their own terms. This shift also exposes a deeper issue. For a long time, male participation was treated as guaranteed. Its absence was never seriously considered. Now that absence is becoming noticeable, and there is confusion about how to respond. You cannot demand trust. You cannot legislate goodwill. You cannot shame people into genuine engagement. If trust is to be rebuilt, it will require acknowledgement rather than dismissal. It will require consistency rather than slogans. It will require recognizing men as individuals rather than symbols. Whether that happens remains to be seen. For now, the reality is this: men have learned that stepping away can bring clarity, stability, and peace. Once those are found, giving them up becomes a serious decision rather than an automatic one. That is the shift that defines this moment. And it is why the conversation is only just beginning. One of the reasons this conversation creates so much discomfort is because it challenges a long standing assumption that social participation is automatic. For a very long time, men were expected to engage, to provide, to protect, and to contribute, regardless of how they were spoken about or treated. That expectation was rarely questioned because it was embedded into culture itself. When that expectation quietly dissolves, the silence it leaves behind feels unsettling. What many people fail to understand is that withdrawal is not driven by a single grievance. It is driven by accumulation. Men did not wake up one day and decide to disengage out of spite. They reached a threshold. That threshold looks different for each individual, but the underlying pattern is consistent. Repeated negative reinforcement teaches people to avoid environments where effort is punished or misinterpreted. There is a tendency to frame men's concerns as exaggerated or hypothetical. That framing ignores the lived experiences that shape behavior. Men respond to outcomes. When they see examples of reputations destroyed overnight, careers ended without due process, or social standing erased based on accusation alone, they internalize a simple rule: minimize exposure, reduce risk, protect yourself. This mindset does not come from hatred, it comes from pattern recognition. Humans are wired to avoid danger once they recognize it. When danger is social rather than physical, avoidance still applies. The difference is that social danger often hides behind polite language and moral framing, which makes it harder to identify until damage is already done. Another uncomfortable truth is that many men no longer believe their perspective will be heard fairly. When someone feels unheard long enough, they stop trying to explain. Silence becomes more efficient than dialogue. That silence is often misread as indifference, but it is more accurately resignation. There is also a growing awareness among men that vulnerability carries asymmetric risk. Being open emotionally is often encouraged in theory, but discouraged in practice when it conflicts with expectations or narratives. Men learn quickly which parts of themselves are acceptable to express and which parts create problems. Over time, they stop sharing altogether. This creates a strange paradox. Men are told they need to open up, yet punished when they do not open up in the correct way. The rules are often unspoken and inconsistently enforced. That inconsistency breeds caution. When people cannot predict outcomes, they default to self preservation. Many men also recognize that once trust is lost, regaining it is not guaranteed. Trust requires accountability on all sides. When accountability feels one directional, trust collapses. Men are not asking for perfection, they are asking for fairness and proportionality. Without those, engagement feels like a gamble rather than a partnership. Another factor that cannot be ignored is how conflict is handled. Healthy systems resolve conflict through dialogue and repair. Unhealthy systems escalate conflict through labeling and exclusion. Men have watched conflict resolution shift away from conversation and toward punishment. That shift changes how people behave. When mistakes are treated as moral failures rather than learning opportunities, participation declines. It is also worth examining how language shapes perception. When entire groups are discussed in sweeping generalizations, individuals within those groups feel erased. Men hear statements about what men are like, what men do, and what men cause. Even when those statements are framed as critiques of behavior, they land as personal accusations. Over time, people disengage from conversations where they feel prejudged. This disengagement extends beyond personal relationships into professional and social spaces. Men become more cautious at work. They avoid mentoring, avoid informal interactions, and limit communication to what is strictly necessary. This is not because they lack goodwill, but because they are minimizing exposure. The long term impact of this behavior is difficult to quantify, but it is significant. When informal networks dissolve, collaboration suffers. When mentorship disappears, skill transfer slows. When trust erodes, efficiency declines. These are not dramatic collapses, they are gradual declines that compound over time. There is also a misunderstanding about what men are seeking when they withdraw. Many assume men are isolating out of bitterness or resentment. In reality, many men report improved mental clarity, reduced stress, and greater control over their time. They are not waiting to be convinced to return. They have already found alternatives that meet their needs. Technology has amplified this shift. Men can build businesses, learn skills, form communities, and entertain themselves without relying on traditional social structures. Independence is no longer a fringe option. It is accessible and scalable. Once independence becomes viable, dependency loses its leverage. This raises an important question. If men can meet their needs without participating in systems that feel hostile or unstable, why would they return? The answer cannot be guilt or obligation. It would have to be value. Systems must offer something meaningful in return for engagement. Another element often ignored is how men define success. For a long time, success was tied to external validation. Status, relationships, and societal approval were central markers. Many men are now redefining success internally. Peace of mind, autonomy, and alignment with personal values are becoming more important than recognition. This internal shift changes everything. When external approval no longer drives behavior, social pressure loses effectiveness. Men are less reactive to criticism and less motivated by praise. They become self directed. This makes them harder to manipulate, but also harder to mobilize. There is also a protective element to this withdrawal. Men are choosing environments where expectations are clear and outcomes are predictable. Ambiguity is the enemy of trust. When rules are unclear or change retroactively, people disengage. Clear boundaries create stability, and stability fosters well being. One of the most striking aspects of the shift is how quiet it is. There are no slogans or organized movements required. Each man reaches his own conclusions independently. That is why it is so widespread. It is not coordinated, it is organic. When organic shifts reach a certain scale, they become structural. At that point, reversing them requires addressing root causes rather than surface behaviors. Surface level messaging will not be enough. Trust cannot be rebuilt through campaigns or branding alone. Another difficult truth is that many men no longer believe reconciliation is a priority. They have adapted to life without certain expectations. They have built routines that do not rely on approval or validation from external sources. Asking them to return without meaningful change feels like asking them to give up stability for uncertainty. There is also a generational echo effect. Younger men observe older men who have disengaged and see the benefits. They learn earlier to set boundaries and limit exposure. This accelerates the trend. Each generation internalizes the lesson faster than the last. This is not a judgment, it is an observation. Systems that fail to adapt to feedback eventually lose participants. Feedback does not always come in the form of complaints, sometimes it comes in the form of absence. The idea that men will eventually be forced back by necessity underestimates the adaptability of modern life. People can live smaller, simpler lives by choice. They can prioritize fewer obligations. They can design lifestyles that minimize friction. Once that option is visible, it cannot be unseen. There is also a misconception that men are disengaging because they lack resilience. In reality, many men disengage precisely because they are resilient. They choose strategies that preserve energy rather than waste it on unproductive conflict. Resilience does not always look like endurance. Sometimes it looks like strategic withdrawal. This brings us to a critical point. Walking away is not the same as giving up, it is a form of agency. It is choosing where to invest effort and where not to. Men are becoming more selective, not less capable. When people talk about rebuilding trust, they often focus on messaging rather than structure. Structure matters more, incentives matter more, consistency matters more. Trust grows when actions align with words over time. Without that alignment, calls for participation sound hollow. Men are listening, but they are also watching. They are comparing promises to outcomes. When those do not match, disengagement continues. Another aspect of this shift is how men view responsibility. Responsibility without authority is a recipe for frustration. Many men feel they are held responsible for outcomes they do not control. That imbalance discourages engagement. People are willing to take responsibility when they have agency. Without agency, responsibility becomes a burden rather than an honor. This ties into broader societal structures. Decision making power has become increasingly centralized, while accountability remains diffuse. Men are often expected to comply without influence. Over time, compliance without input breeds detachment. The result is a quiet recalibration. Men are choosing to focus on what they can control. Health, skills, finances, and personal development become primary. External validation becomes secondary. This is not antisocial behavior, it is adaptive behavior. There is also a spiritual or philosophical element to this shift. Many men are questioning narratives they once accepted without scrutiny. They are asking what actually leads to fulfillment. They are examining whether traditional paths still align with reality. These questions do not have easy answers, but they lead to introspection. Introspection often leads to simplification. Simplification leads to clarity. Clarity leads to boundaries. Boundaries that lead to distance from sources of stress. This is the progression many men describe in once they step back. It is important to understand that this shift does not require universal agreement to have impact. Even partial disengagement changes dynamics. When fewer men participate, the load on those who remain increases. That creates additional incentives to disengage. This feedback loop reinforces itself. Attempts to reverse this trend without acknowledging its causes are unlikely to succeed. You cannot shame people into trusting you. You cannot threaten people into genuine engagement. You cannot demand vulnerability while punishing it. If change is to occur, it will require humility, listening, and structural reform. Whether that happens remains uncertain. What is certain is that men have already adapted to the current environment. They are not waiting for permission. They are not asking for validation. They are building lives that make sense to them. That is the reality that defines this moment. There is a moment many men describe when the shift becomes permanent. It is not dramatic. There is no argument or final confrontation. It is simply the point where effort stops feeling meaningful. When a man realizes that no amount of explanation changes outcomes, he stops explaining. When he realizes that goodwill is treated as weakness, he stops offering it freely. That moment is quiet, but it is decisive. Once that line is crossed, the world looks different. Social expectations lose their weight. Opinions that once felt urgent begin to sound distant. Men start asking a simple question that reshapes everything. What do I actually owe? And to whom? When that question is answered honestly, many discover that their obligations were assumed rather than agreed upon. This is where the idea of walking away becomes misunderstood. Walking away is not about rejecting responsibility altogether. It is about choosing responsibility selectively. Men are still taking care of themselves, their families when applicable, and their commitments. What they are no longer doing is volunteering for roles that carry high risk and low reward. One reason this shift is so difficult for society to process is because it exposes how much was taken for granted. Male participation was treated as an unlimited resource. When that resource becomes scarce, the imbalance becomes visible. The systems that relied on silent compliance begin to strain. Another overlooked element is how men respond to long term uncertainty. Humans can tolerate hardship when the path forward is clear. What they struggle with is endless ambiguity. Many men feel they are operating under rules that can change without warning. That uncertainty creates chronic stress. Stepping away removes that stress almost immediately. This relief is powerful. It reinforces the decision to disengage. Once a man experiences life without constant vigilance, returning to that state feels unnecessary and unwise. Peace becomes the baseline rather than the exception. There is also a narrative that men disengage because they cannot handle criticism. That interpretation ignores how criticism is delivered and framed. Constructive criticism is specific, proportional, and aimed at improvement. What many men experience instead is generalized blame. That does not invite growth, it invites distance. Distance then becomes misinterpreted as apathy. In reality, it is boundary setting. Men are deciding where their energy is best spent. They are opting out of cycles that feel unproductive or adversarial. This boundary setting extends into communication. Men speak less not because they have nothing to say, but because they are choosing silence strategically. Silence avoids misinterpretation. Silence avoids escalation. Silence preserves options. There is also an economic layer to this shift that deserves careful attention. When men disengage from traditional expectations, their spending patterns change. They prioritize savings, investments, and self sufficiency over external validation. This has downstream effects on markets that were built around consumption tied to social status. Financial independence becomes both a goal and a shield. The more independent a man becomes, the less leverage external systems have over him. This independence is not about domination or control, it is about reducing vulnerability. Reducing vulnerability is a rational response to perceived risk. Men are not imagining that risk. They have observed consequences play out publicly and privately. They have learned from others' experiences as well as their own. Another critical aspect of the shift is how men relate to time. When men disengage from high friction environments, they regain time and mental bandwidth. That time gets reinvested into skills, health, and personal interests. Over time, these investments compound. Life improves in tangible ways. As life improves, the incentive to re enter stressful dynamics decreases further. This creates a widening gap between those who disengage and those who remain embedded in conflict driven systems. The gap is not just emotional, it is practical. This is why appeals that rely on a nostalgia often fail. They reference a version of reality that no longer exists. Men are not rejecting relationships or society in abstract terms. They are rejecting specific conditions. Without addressing those conditions, appeals sound disconnected. There is also a tendency to underestimate men's capacity for long term thinking. Men are often portrayed as impulsive or short sighted. In reality, many are making deliberate, forward looking decisions. They are optimizing for stability over decades, not validation in the moment. This long term perspective also shapes how men view reconciliation. Reconciliation requires trust that future conditions will be different from past ones. Without credible signals of change, reconciliation feels risky. Men are unwilling to gamble stability on promises alone. Another layer to this conversation is how men perceive fairness. Fairness does not mean equal outcomes, it means consistent rules. When rules appear selectively enforced or retroactively applied, fairness erodes. Men respond by minimizing exposure to those systems. This is not unique to gender dynamics. It applies to any environment where rules feel arbitrary. People disengage when predictability disappears. Men are simply responding to incentives as they exist. There is also a cultural reluctance to acknowledge male disengagement as valid. It is often framed as something to be corrected rather than understood. That framing itself reinforces disengagement. People rarely move toward environments where their perspective is dismissed by default. Understanding does not require agreement, it requires curiosity. Many men feel that curiosity about their experiences is absent. That absence speaks louder than criticism. Another important point is that men are not coordinating this shift through ideology. There is no manifesto required. The common thread is experience. When enough individuals reach similar conclusions independently, patterns emerge. These patterns are already visible in data. Declining participation rates, delayed milestones, and changing priorities are measurable. These are not anecdotes, they are trends. What is often missing from analysis is the internal experience driving those trends. Statistics show what is happening. Stories explain why. Men's stories are increasingly absent from mainstream narratives. When stories disappear, so does empathy. Empathy is not sympathy, it is understanding perspective. Without empathy, solutions become superficial. They address symptoms rather than causes. One of the more sobering realizations is that this shift may not be reversible in the way many assume. Even if conditions improve, trust takes time to rebuild. Some men will never return to previous levels of engagement. They have already adapted to a different way of living. That does not mean society collapses overnight. It means it changes shape. Systems adjust. New norms emerge. The question is whether those changes are intentional or reactive. Reactive change is often chaotic. Intentional change requires acknowledgement of uncomfortable truths. Whether that acknowledgement happens remains an open question. Men are not asking to be centered or privileged. Many are simply asking not to be treated as inherently suspect. When that baseline is missing, participation feels optional rather than obligatory. Another misunderstanding is the belief that disengagement equals isolation. Many men are building strong peer networks based on mutual respect and shared interests. These networks are smaller but more stable. They are built on consent rather than expectation. These communities often operate quietly outside mainstream attention. They do not seek validation, they seek functionality. This makes them resilient. Resilience is the thread running through this entire shift. Men are not breaking, they are adapting. Adaptation does not always look like growth from the outside, but it often is. There is also an internal recalibration of identity happening. Men are redefining what it means to live a good life. They are questioning scripts they inherited and deciding which ones still make sense. This process is deeply personal and cannot be rushed. When identity becomes self defined rather than socially imposed, external pressure loses effectiveness. Men become less reactive and more intentional. That intentionality is protective. This brings us back to the core issue of trust. Trust cannot exist without mutual accountability. When accountability feels one sided, trust collapses. Men are responding to that collapse by removing themselves from environments where they feel exposed. If trust is to be rebuilt, it will require more than rhetoric. It will require structural consistency over time. It will require demonstrating fairness in action, not just in language. Until then, men will continue to prioritize peace, stability, and autonomy. They will continue to build lives that minimize unnecessary risk. They will continue to walk away quietly rather than argue loudly. This is not a protest. It is not a threat. It is a choice. And once a choice proves effective, it becomes permanent. What makes this moment different from past cultural shifts is that there is no clear pressure point to reverse it. In previous eras, disengagement was often met with material hardship or social isolation that eventually pushed people back into participation. Today, those pressures are weaker. Men can survive and even thrive without constant social entanglement. That reality changes the balance of power in subtle but profound ways. When participation is optional rather than necessary, it must be earned. That is the quiet truth underlying this entire shift. Systems that once relied on obligation now face individuals who evaluate value. Men are asking themselves whether engagement improves their lives or complicates them. Increasingly, the answer they arrive at is simple. Another factor accelerating this change is how quickly reputations can be shaped in the digital age. Stories travel faster than context. Accusations travel faster than clarification. Once a narrative takes hold, correcting it becomes nearly impossible. Men are acutely aware of this dynamic. They have watched others lose years of effort in moments. That awareness shapes behavior more than any lecture ever could. This creates an environment where caution becomes rational. Men limit exposure not because they assume the worst of everyone, but because they understand how little control they have once a story escapes their hands. Risk management becomes a daily consideration rather than an abstract idea. There is also a growing recognition that good intentions do not protect against bad outcomes. Many men were raised to believe that acting honorably would shield them from serious consequences. Experience has taught them otherwise. Outcomes matter more than intentions, and interpretations matter more than facts in many public spaces. When that lesson sinks in, behavior changes permanently. Men become more reserved, more calculated, and more selective. This is not bitterness, it is learning. Another important aspect of the shift is how men relate to authority. Authority that is perceived as fair earns compliance. Authority that feels arbitrary earns avoidance. Many men feel that authority structures no longer operate with predictable standards. When predictability disappears, respect erodes. This erosion of respect does not lead to rebellion. It leads to disengagement. Men do not seek to overthrow systems they distrust. They simply stop relying on them. They build parallel structures or reduce dependence altogether. That reduction in dependence is visible across many areas of life. Men are learning skills that increase self sufficiency. They are prioritizing physical health to reduce reliance on external systems. They are managing finances conservatively to maintain flexibility. Each of these choices increases autonomy. Autonomy is the common thread connecting these decisions. The more autonomous a man becomes, the less vulnerable he feels. Vulnerability is not weakness, but unmanaged vulnerability is dangerous. Men are learning to manage it carefully. There is also a misconception that men disengage because they are afraid of challenge. In reality, many are choosing challenges they can control. Physical training, entrepreneurship, creative pursuits, and technical mastery all provide feedback loops that are clear and proportional. Effort leads to outcome in a way that feels fair. Contrast that with environments where effort and outcome feel disconnected and the preference becomes obvious. Men gravitate towards systems that reward competence consistently. They withdraw from systems where outcomes feel arbitrary. This preference is not ideological, it is practical. People invest where returns are reliable. Unreliable systems lose participants over time. Another layer to the shift involves communication styles. Men often communicate directly and value clarity. When communication becomes indirect, ambiguous, or emotionally charged, misunderstandings increase. Men respond by limiting communication to essential interactions only. This narrowing of communication is often misinterpreted as emotional distance. In reality, it is a strategy to reduce friction. Clear boundaries simplify life. Simplification is a recurring theme among men who have disengaged. They simplify routines, relationships, and expectations. Complexity is reduced wherever possible. The result is often a calmer, more focused life. As life becomes calmer, tolerance for chaos decreases. Men who have found stability are reluctant to reintroduce instability. This makes re engagement difficult unless conditions have clearly improved. Another challenge in addressing this shift is that it does not fit neatly into existing narratives. It is not a crisis that can be solved with a single policy or campaign. It is a slow cultural realignment driven by millions of individual decisions. Individual decisions are harder to influence than collective movements. You cannot negotiate with silence. You cannot debate absence. You can only change the conditions that made disengagement appealing in the first place. This requires an honest assessment of incentives. Why would someone choose to engage when they can opt out with fewer downsides? Answering that question honestly is uncomfortable, but necessary. It also requires moving away from moral framing and toward practical evaluation. People do not respond well to being told what they should feel. They respond to environments that align with their interests and values. Men are not immune to social influence, but they are increasingly resistant to messaging that does not match reality. Credibility matters. Consistency matters. Long-term behavior matters more than short-term statements. Another overlooked factor is how men process risk emotionally. Men tend to internalize stress rather than externalize it. Disengagement becomes a pressure release valve. It allows stress to dissipate rather than accumulate. And when disengagement improves mental health, it reinforces itself. Men associate withdrawal with well being. That association is powerful and difficult to undo. This does not mean men have stopped caring about society. Many still care deeply. They simply care from a distance. They contribute selectively and on their own terms. Selective contribution is another hallmark of this shift. Men are not disappearing entirely. They are choosing when and how to show up. They are investing in areas where impact is tangible and appreciation is genuine. This selective approach challenges traditional expectations of constant availability. Availability was once assumed. Now it must be negotiated. Negotiation requires mutual respect. Without it, there is no incentive to participate. Men are not asking for special treatment, they are asking for basic reciprocity. Reciprocity is the foundation of trust. When effort is reciprocated, engagement flourishes. When effort is punished or dismissed, engagement fades. One reason this conversation remains difficult is that it forces a reevaluation of long held assumptions. It asks whether existing systems are truly aligned with the people they depend on. That is not a comfortable question. Avoiding the question does not stop the trend. It simply delays adaptation. Meanwhile, men continue to adjust quietly. There is also a temporal element to consider. The longer disengagement persists, the more normal it becomes. New habits form, new identities solidify. Returning to previous patterns becomes less likely with each passing year. This is why time matters. Delayed response increases the cost of change. Early acknowledgement could have softened the shift. Prolonged denial hardens it. Another reality is that men are increasingly aware of alternatives. Global connectivity exposes different lifestyles and value systems. Men compare outcomes across cultures and communities. They learn from examples outside their immediate environment. Exposure to alternatives expands the range of perceived choices. When people realize they have options, compliance declines. Choice empowers. Empowerment is not inherently disruptive, but it does require systems to adapt. Systems that fail to adapt lose relevance. Men are not trying to dismantle anything, they are simply living in ways that make sense to them. That quiet pragmatism is what makes this shift durable. It is also why simplistic explanations fall short. This is not about anger, fear, or ideology alone. It is about alignment between effort and outcome. When alignment exists, people engage willingly. When it does not, they disengage rationally. Understanding this is the first step toward any meaningful response. Without understanding, reactions will continue to miss the mark. Men have already made their adjustments. They are not waiting, they are moving forward. Whether society chooses to adapt alongside them is the question that remains. There's a tendency in public discussion to treat male disengagement as something that can be reversed with enough encouragement or pressure. That belief misunderstands how decisions harden over time. When a man restructures his life around peace, autonomy, and predictability, those values become non negotiable. Any environment that threatens them is evaluated skeptically, no matter how it is framed. This is where many attempts at persuasion fail. They appeal to emotion rather than experience. Men are not persuaded by promises that contradict what they have already lived through. Experience outweighs messaging every time. When words and outcomes diverge, trust does not just weaken, it collapses. Another critical element in this shift is the role of accountability. Accountability builds credibility when it is applied consistently. When accountability feels selective or symbolic, credibility erodes. Men are acutely sensitive to this because selective accountability introduces uncertainty. Uncertainty is the opposite of safety. Safety in this context does not mean comfort, it means predictability. Men are willing to endure hardship when the rules are clear and applied evenly. What they reject is environments where consequences are unpredictable or one sided. Walking away becomes the rational choice in such conditions. There is also a quiet grief embedded in this transition that is rarely acknowledged. Many men did not set out to disengage. They had expectations shaped by earlier narratives about partnership, contribution, and mutual respect. Letting go of those expectations involves loss, even when withdrawal brings relief. That grief is processed privately. Men rarely receive validation for it. Instead, it is often dismissed or reframed as weakness. That dismissal deepens the divide. People are more likely to disengage from environments that invalidate their emotional reality. The private processing of grief often leads to personal transformation. Men reassess priorities, they simplify goals, they stop chasing external markers that no longer resonate. Over time, this creates a quieter but more grounded sense of identity. This grounded identity is harder to destabilize. Men who know what they value are less reactive to criticism. They are less likely to seek approval from systems they distrust. That independence is stabilizing. Another overlooked factor is how male friendships change during this shift. As men disengage from high friction environments, they often deepen bonds with a smaller circle of trusted peers. These relationships are built on shared experience rather than social expectation. Trust within these circles is earned slowly and protected carefully. Once established, it becomes a source of strength. Men who have such networks are less vulnerable to isolation and less dependent on broader social validation. This is important because it contradicts the idea that disengagement leads to loneliness. For many men, it leads to fewer but more meaningful connections. Quality replaces quantity. Quality connections reduce tolerance for performative relationships. Men become less willing to engage in interactions that feel transactional or adversarial. They prioritize authenticity over appearance. This prioritization also influences how men engage online. They curate information carefully. They avoid spaces that amplify conflict without resolution. They seek long form discussion over sound bites. This changes the nature of their participation. As men withdraw from public discourse, the discourse itself shifts. Voices that remain become more polarized, nuance decreases. This creates a distorted perception of consensus. Silence is mistaken for agreement when it is often disengagement. This distortion further discourages participation. Men do not see their perspectives represented accurately, so they opt out entirely. This creates a self reinforcing cycle where absence leads to misrepresentation, which leads to further absence. Breaking the cycle would require intentional inclusion of diverse male perspectives without presumption of guilt or defect. Whether that inclusion is forthcoming remains uncertain. Another dimension of the shift is how men relate to purpose. For many, purpose was once tied to external roles: provider, partner, contributor. As those roles become less stable or less valued, men redefine purpose internally. Internal purpose is resilient. It does not depend on external approval. It can be sustained independently. Men who develop internal purpose are less likely to compromise it for uncertain rewards. This internalization of purpose also changes how men respond to criticism. Criticism no longer threatens identity. It becomes information that can be evaluated or discarded. This emotional detachment is protective. Protection is not hostility, it is a self regulation. Men are learning to regulate exposure to stressors rather than absorb them reflexively. This regulation extends to emotional labor. Men are becoming more selective about where they invest empathy and effort. They are not less empathetic, they are more discerning. And discerning empathy preserves energy, it prevents burnout. Men who were once exhausted by constant expectation find renewal in selectivity. Renewal reinforces disengagement. When life improves after withdrawal, returning to previous patterns feels unnecessary. Improvement validates the decision. Another challenge in addressing this shift is the assumption that men are waiting for validation to return. Many are not. They have already validated their choices through improved well being. Appeals that ignore this reality fail because they speak to a past version of the individual. Men have moved on psychologically. They are not seeking permission. They are exercising agency. Agency is central to this entire conversation. Men are reclaiming control over their time, attention, and emotional investment. Once reclaimed, control is rarely surrendered lightly. This reclamation is subtle. It does not announce itself. It is visible only in changed behavior. Less availability, fewer commitments, clearer boundaries. Boundaries are often misinterpreted as hostility. In reality, they are clarity. Men are clarifying what they are willing to engage with and what they are not. Clarity reduces conflict. It also reduces participation in environments that do not respect boundaries. This selective participation reshapes social dynamics. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this shift is its permanence. People assume disengagement is a phase. For some, it may be. For many, it is a reorientation. Reorientation changes default settings. Men are not waiting to be convinced. They are evaluating based on outcomes. Outcomes so far have reinforced their choices: less stress, more control, greater focus, improved mental health. These are powerful incentives. They outweigh abstract appeals to duty or tradition. Tradition only holds power when it aligns with lived reality. When reality diverges, tradition loses relevance. Men are responding to reality. There's also an evolutionary logic to this behavior. Humans adapt to environments that reward certain behaviors. When environments punish engagement, avoidance increases. This is not ideology, it is adaptation. Adaptation does not require consensus, it occurs individually and aggregates collectively. That is what we are witnessing. Another point worth considering is how quickly norms can shift once a tipping point is reached. What was once rare becomes common. What was once questioned becomes accepted. We may already be near such a tipping point. Male disengagement is no longer fringe, it is increasingly normalized. Normalization reduces stigma. Reduced stigma accelerates adoption. This feedback loop strengthens the trend. At this stage, reversal would require not just reform, but trust rebuilding over time. Trust rebuilding is slow and fragile. It cannot be rushed. Men are patient when they believe progress is genuine. They are skeptical when it feels performative. Performance without substance deepens cynicism. Substance without performance rebuilds credibility. The path forward, if one exists, lies in alignment between words and actions. Men are watching closely. They are not hostile. They are cautious. And caution is not weakness, it is wisdom earned through experience. As long as caution is justified by outcomes, disengagement will continue. Men will keep choosing peace over conflict, clarity over ambiguity, autonomy over obligation. They will continue to walk away quietly rather than demand attention loudly. And in that quiet, a new normal is already taking shape. One of the most misunderstood elements of this entire shift is how little drama is involved from the perspective of the men making these choices. From the outside, disengagement is often framed as extreme or reactionary. From the inside, it feels calm, methodical, and even boring. That is precisely why it is so durable. It is not fueled by outrage, it is fueled by relief. Relief comes from no longer feeling on edge, no longer feeling the need to constantly monitor words, tone, posture, or intent, no longer replaying interactions in the mind, wondering how they might be reframed later. When that background noise disappears, mental space opens up. Men describe thinking more clearly, sleeping better, and feeling less tension in everyday life. That reduction in tension changes how men see the world. Situations that once felt urgent now feel optional. Conflicts that once demanded response now feel avoidable. This is not apathy, it is prioritization. Men are learning that not every issue requires their participation. Participation used to be assumed, now it is chosen. That distinction matters. When participation is chosen, it is more honest. When it is assumed, it breeds resentment over time. Another reason disengagement is difficult to reverse is that it rewires habits. Men restructure daily routines around solitude, focus, and autonomy. They develop systems that work without external dependency. These systems become comfortable. Comfort creates inertia. Inertia does not mean stagnation. Many men are growing rapidly in areas they control. Physical health improves. Financial discipline strengthens. Skills compound. Progress becomes visible and measurable. Measurable progress is addictive in a healthy way. It reinforces effort. Men gravitate toward environments where effort reliably produces results. This makes returning to unpredictable dynamics feel counterproductive. There is also an important psychological shift happening around validation. Men are detaching from the need to be understood by everyone. They are becoming comfortable being misunderstood by those outside their circle. This detachment is liberating. Liberation from constant explanation frees energy. Men stop trying to prove intentions. They stop seeking approval. They let actions speak for themselves, even if those actions are unseen. This invisibility is often misread as disengagement from life itself. In reality, it is disengagement from noise. Men are still living fully, just more quietly. Quiet living does not generate headlines. It does not trend. That is why it is often overlooked. But it is growing. Another factor strengthening this shift is how men perceive fairness over time. They are not looking for perfect systems. They are looking for systems that improve when flaws are identified. When flaws are denied or reframed as virtues, confidence erodes. Men have watched conversations stall because acknowledging discomfort was treated as betrayal. That signals to them that honest feedback is unwelcome. When feedback is unwelcome, exit becomes the only option. Exit is easier than argument. Argument requires trust that engagement will lead somewhere. Without that trust, silence is more efficient. Efficiency is a core value for many men. They prefer solutions that minimize wasted energy. Disengagement in this context is an efficient response to persistent friction. Another misunderstood aspect is how men view sacrifice. Men are often willing to sacrifice when there is a clear sense of shared purpose. When sacrifice feels expected but unappreciated, willingness declines. Appreciation is not praise, it is recognition of contribution. When contribution is reframed as obligation, appreciation disappears. Men notice that shift quickly. Once appreciation is gone, motivation fades. This is not unique to men, it is universal. The difference is how quietly men respond. They do not protest loudly, they step back. Stepping back creates space for reflection. Reflection leads to insight. Insight leads to change. Many men describe a realization that they were overextended. They were investing in areas that did not return value. Once they pulled back, life simplified. Simplification reduces stress. Reduced stress improves decision making. Better decisions reinforce the new lifestyle. This positive feedback loop is powerful. It is one reason disengagement spreads organically. Men talk privately, they compare notes, they see similar benefits. These conversations are not ideological, they are practical. What changed for you? What improved? What did not? The answers are often consistent. Consistency builds confidence. Confidence strengthens resolve. Another reason disengagement persists is that men do not feel a strong pull to return. The narrative that men are missing out assumes that what they left was fulfilling. Many do not share that assumption, and fulfillment is subjective. Men are discovering fulfillment in mastery, autonomy, and peace. These are durable sources of satisfaction. Durable satisfaction does not require constant reinforcement. It does not depend on social approval. It is stable. Stability becomes a baseline expectation. Anything that threatens it is scrutinized carefully. This scrutiny is not hostility, it is discernment. Men are discerning where they invest themselves. Discerning investment is a hallmark of maturity. It reflects learning from experience. Experience has taught many men that not all opportunities are worth taking. Some carry hidden costs. Walking away avoids those costs. Avoiding unnecessary cost is rational behavior. It is not bitterness or fear. It is prudence. Another layer to the shift involves how men interpret responsibility. Responsibility without reciprocal respect becomes burden. Men are unwilling to carry burdens that feel imposed rather than chosen. Chosen responsibility feels meaningful. Imposed responsibility feels draining. Men are increasingly choosing where they accept responsibility. This selectivity reshapes their lives. It also reshapes expectations. When men stop filling gaps automatically, those gaps become visible. Visibility forces reevaluation. Reevaluation can lead to reform or denial. Denial delays change. Reform requires humility. Humility is rare in large systems. That is one reason disengagement continues. Men are not waiting for systems to change, they are adapting regardless. Adaptation does not require permission, it is a survival skill. Another important point is that disengagement is not uniform. It exists on a spectrum. Some men withdraw completely, others reduce exposure, others engage selectively. Even partial disengagement alters dynamics. When fewer men participate fully, the overall system feels different. That difference is already noticeable in many spaces. Participation rates decline. Engagement becomes transactional. Depth decreases. Depth requires trust. Trust requires consistency. Consistency has been lacking for many men. That perception drives behavior. Perception matters as much as intent. Men act based on what they observe, not what they are told. Observations over time shape beliefs. Beliefs shape choices. Choices aggregate into trends. Trends reshape culture. We are in the middle of that process now. The future outcome is not predetermined, but the trajectory is clear. Men have learned that they can live well without constant engagement in high friction environments. They have learned that peace is attainable and worth protecting. They have learned that autonomy is empowering. Once learned, these lessons are not easily forgotten. This is why attempts to shame, pressure, or guilt men back into old roles fail. Those tactics assume leverage that no longer exists. Leverage disappears when dependency disappears. Dependency has been declining steadily. As dependency declines, agency rises. Agency changes everything. Men are no longer asking what they are expected to do. They are asking what makes sense for their lives. That question leads to answers that often diverge from traditional expectations. Divergence does not mean rejection of society. It means selective participation. Selective participation is the new norm for many men, and whether that norm expands or stabilizes will depend on how conditions evolve. But the direction of change is already visible. Men are walking away not in anger, but in clarity. And clarity, once gained, is difficult to surrender. At this point, the picture should be clear. What is happening is not a sudden rebellion, not a tantrum, and not a phase. It is a long forming response to incentives, experiences, and outcomes that accumulated over decades. Men did not arrive here lightly. They arrived here carefully, quietly, and deliberately. The biggest mistake being made right now is assuming this is about anger. Anger fades. Anger burns out. Anger looks for confrontation. What we are seeing instead is resolve. Resolve is calm. Resolve does not shout. Resolve simply changes direction and keeps walking. And when men walk away, they do not announce it because they are not trying to persuade anyone. They are not seeking approval or validation. They are responding to what they have learned works for them. Life becomes simpler. Risk becomes manageable. Peace becomes attainable. That combination is powerful. Another mistake is assuming that men are unaware of the broader consequences of their withdrawal. Many are aware. They simply no longer believe it is their responsibility to sacrifice themselves to stabilize systems that do not reciprocate trust or respect. Responsibility without reciprocity is not noble. It is unsustainable. There is also a tendency to frame male disengagement as selfish. That framing ignores how often men were expected to prioritize others while suppressing their own needs. Choosing self preservation after prolonged imbalance is not selfish, it is corrective. Correction does not require hostility, it requires boundaries. Men are setting boundaries where none existed before. They are defining limits clearly, sometimes for the first time in their lives. Those boundaries are not threats, they are statements of intent. Intent matters. Men are not trying to punish anyone, they are trying to protect themselves. Protection is a basic human instinct. When protection becomes necessary in social spaces, withdrawal becomes logical. It is also important to understand that many men would have preferred things to turn out differently. They did not seek this outcome, they adapted to it. Adaptation is not an ideological stance, it is a response to environment. Environment shapes behavior more than slogans ever will. When environments feel unstable, people retreat. When they feel fair, people engage. Men are reacting to what they experience, not what they are told to believe. This is why messaging alone cannot fix what is happening. You cannot reframe lived experience out of existence. You cannot talk people into trusting systems that have repeatedly failed them. Trust is rebuilt through consistency over time, not declarations. Until that consistency exists, men will continue doing what makes sense for them individually. They will continue prioritizing autonomy, stability, and peace, They will continue designing lives that minimize unnecessary exposure to risk. For many men, walking away has been clarifying. It stripped away noise. It revealed what actually matters: health, financial security, purpose chosen rather than assigned, relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. That clarity creates confidence. Confidence reduces fear. Reduced fear makes manipulation ineffective. This is why attempts to shame or pressure men back into old roles fail. Those tactics rely on emotional leverage that no longer works. Men who have found peace are not easily provoked. They are not easily distracted. They are not easily guilted. They are grounded. Grounded men do not need to announce their independence. They simply live it. The broader question is not whether men will return to old patterns. The question is whether systems will adapt to the reality that participation is no longer guaranteed. That adaptation will require humility, accountability, and fairness that is demonstrated consistently, not promised occasionally. Whether that happens or not, men have already adjusted. They are not waiting. They are moving forward. This is not the end of society. It is the end of an assumption. The assumption that men will always show up regardless of how they are treated. That assumption no longer holds. What replaces it will shape the future. It could lead to healthier dynamics built on consent and reciprocity, or it could lead to further fragmentation if denial continues. But one thing is certain: men are no longer confused about what they want. They want peace, they want predictability, they want respect expressed through action rather than rhetoric. They are willing to work, contribute, and build, but only in environments that make sense. Environments that punish trust do not qualify. So, when people ask where the men went, the answer is simple: they did not disappear. They stepped back, they recalibrated, they chose themselves, and they are not looking back. Now, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what we discussed today? Do you agree with what is happening, or do you see it differently? Leave a comment and share your thoughts below. This conversation matters, and your perspective matters. Unlike the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.